Hey everyone, thanks for joining. We're getting set up here in a second. We had to shift around the YouTube versus Zoom, so thanks for being flexible. Managed to keep the date the same. But thanks for joining. We're gonna go over everything that's new in V3. So now that this is a Zoom meeting instead of YouTube, it might be easier to ask questions, but we'll keep an eye on chat and stuff, and feel free to raise your hand and join at the end. But yeah, let's get started. It's going to be me and Danny here giving you a whirlwind tour of some of the new features. And while it won't be like a complete how to upgrade guide, we'll definitely point you to all the instructions you need to get everything like your app from V2 to V3, and then to take advantage of like the features that are there once you upgrade. So let me post the forum post in the chat here. We'll be working off this. It is quite long, so I understand. Luckily it's linked like table of contents, so you should be able to get where you need to go pretty fast. Just as a preface, this release was like what's in this release, right? The first thing we did was bump the version of Node we're targeting from 12 to 14. And that doesn't give you any features out of the box, but it does reduce like the number of polyfills and the number of like syntax you're going for. So we'll continue to bump that at like a regular cadence, just in concert with like the ecosystem. Node operates at a regular cycle, and even 18, I think, is the new long-term stable, or will be soon. So as people deprecate like the versions of Node we're supporting, you can expect us to do so and include that in a major. And then Fastify, Jest, Prisma all released majors of their own, sometimes for the similar reason. I think they all had features they wanted to get out too, but Jest definitely dropped like node support, Fastify as well. And then features in this one are cell and route parameter pre-rendering, which I'll go over, TypeScript strict mode, which Danny will give you a little heads up on, Fastify v4, and now access to the Fastify instance. And then Jest 29 improvements in test and memory usage, Prisma v4. And then for those of you who use DB-Auth, there's a new WebAuthn feature that may make signing in a little easier for your users. And I guess I'll just get started with the first one. So I'll share my screen here. Here's the blog post or the forum post. And this first feature here, cell and route parameter pre-rendering. So pre-render used to only work. I'm going to work off a Redwood app here. This is like just the test project. And if you are familiar with this routes file here, I'll bump the text one more time. You could only really pre-render pages that didn't have any route parameters in them. So this is a route parameter, the thing between the curly braces. And you can go to like blog post 1 or blog post 2, but with about or slash, like you go to that URL and that's the page you see, and you're not getting like more information from the URL. And it was possible for us to pre-render these ones before because we knew at build time like what the page would look like. But before, it wasn't possible for us to pre-render these because we have no idea which one we should pre-render, like the first blog post, the second one, or what if you have 1,000. It was just a problem of we didn't know how to handle it. So even if you added this pre-render prop here, it would just be ignored before. But in V3, you're welcome to pre-render all your blog posts or just a few. It's up to you. And let's go to the blog post page to see how that works. So the blog post page here, nothing's actually different. This is just a page that renders a cell. So given the ID from the URL, it'll give it to the cell, which will then make a call to the API side to get the information. But if you know ahead of time what blog posts you'd like to pre-render, you can make a new blog post page.route hooks. That's the suffix that's important here. TS file co-located alongside the same page. So in this file, you want to export a new function called route parameters. And you actually have access to the API side here, so you can get whatever data you need if presumably your blog posts are stored in your database. So in this case, this is a little terse, so I'll write it on a few separate lines so we can see what's happening. So you just get posts like from Prisma, like a Prisma call, and we're just getting the first 7 here, for example. And then we're going to map these posts to an IDs object and then return that. So what that return looks like is like, I think in TypeScript, it would look like this or something, right? Of ID string, or it might be a number, but it's just an array of objects with an ID key like that. And these will be fed at build time, which is when you run yarn redwood build or yarn redwood pre-render. And we can see that happen here. So in this test project, if I run yarn redwood build, and I'll do no pre-render just so we can see it in 2 separate steps, but you always have to build before you pre-render. Okay, that's almost done. And I'll leave off the verbose flag for now, but you will see 3 blog posts here get pre-rendered to 3 HTML files. So I only have 3 blog posts in this example project, and I'll fire up Studio just so you can get a quick look at that. Just 3 made with the, I forget what it's called, hipster lorem or something that Rob has popularized in the Redwood community. So let's take a look at those dist files. In web dist, we now have this blog post directory, and this is a little, let me format this so you can see what's going on here. We have the same text actually right here, and as if React had come and rendered all of this out and just saved the HTML to like a page. And what's going to happen here is when you render this in the browser, you're going to see this first, like the HTML, which is going to make like SEO. It's great for that first response. And then you're going to have these scripts come in here and hydrate the page so that you get the interactivity afterwards. And I can actually show now that we've built that, if we serve here and then turn off JavaScript, we should be able to see these pages load that weren't loading before. So blog post 1. So that JavaScript's on. So we saw it render and then come in and re-render to get the new data. But I'm going to disable JavaScript here and then go to 2, for instance. And I've throttled it quite a bit, but you can see it just popped in and now it's done. I've disabled JavaScript so there's no hydration happening afterward, but your page, like this is a cell. So usually it will have to mount before it shows any data. And even before it would just show loading, but now you have like all the data there and making that like first page load really, really nice. A couple more. So for everything you can do with this, there's 2 doc pages you want to go to, and they're both in the pre-render doc. The first new section is dynamic routes and route hooks, which goes over exactly what that, like how to handle route parameters here and like what this route parameters function is. And you do have access to this route object to give you a little more info if you want like the name of the route to influence how you're pre-rendering something. And then in later down here, cell pre-rendering, we'll go over like what happens. There's a little bit of a gotcha here with authentication. So you have to be, you're not going to be logged in when you run yarn redwood build. And if the content depends on your user, it's going to be obviously impossible to pre-render that kind of info at build time. So there's, just be aware of that gotcha, but there's documentation on it here. And then there's the thing you always have to remember when you pre-render, which is you need to make sure the code that's running can be run by node. And so if like things break for you when you start pre-rendering, you're gonna just want to go like over the pre-render basics first. And obviously always ask us for like any questions. And Toby was the one who implemented this feature. So he wrote this super long blog post about it that gets into the weeds a bit, which is also pretty fun. And one thing that's coming in the future that he kind of teases here is he calls it exec SSG, but he has a little script that comes in and actually removes these two tags so that the page basically becomes static HTML completely and doesn't even like have any React component to it or interactivity. So it's not out of the box with Redwood yet, but something we're thinking about, like what if you had a page that you just wanted to render completely static? You could pre-render it and then tell it like not to hydrate itself. So I think that was most of everything for this first feature. Did I miss anything, Danny?
No, sounds good, Tom. I think maybe what we should expand on is why you're returning the IDs from the root file, because when I first used this feature, I got confused a little bit. So there's a slight conceptual leak. So you can explain it if you want.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So you can think about it as like when pre-render comes and sees this route, what information like does it need to like render everything in this blog post page? Like you can think of it as you need to pass like a prop to this blog post page component, and that prop is like ID, like that, or else you're gonna get like no useful information without that one. It's just gonna be like a loading screen, like waiting to get the data. So this route parameters like is basically values for this here, this ID. And if you had it named something else, like I don't know, host ID, I think you would just call it host ID here so that you have the right, the variables are just, one-to-one in the names. And if there were more, I'm not sure how this specific route would work, but you would add it here as if you're just passing like props to a React component. Cool. I think that's that feature. That's definitely the one we're super proud about and want everyone to try out. So if you had pre-rendering before, just like slap it on a few more routes and add that routes hooks file for whatever you want to pre-render. And if not, just get a few more pages. I think next, were we going to go to TypeScript or?
Yeah, I can. So, this one is a little bit deep in the weeds for us TypeScript users. So V3 comes with like a huge number of TypeScript changes, but I'm going to try and keep it really short and brief so that everyone can relate. Often with these type changes, it really takes a lot of understanding, or you have to get into the weeds to know what the problem is in the first place. So I have a really simple example here, before and after. So the purple project is a V2 project. And so there's a little gotcha that happens when you use GraphQL with Prisma. Remember, there are two sets of types in the GraphQL Prisma. There's the type that you define based on your SDL. And then there's the type that you define based on your Prisma schema. And usually there is a really strong correlation, not necessarily one-to-one, but strong correlation between the Prisma type and the SDL type. But there are a couple of exceptions that that might happen as your project grows. So let's say in my SDL, I add an SDL only property. What that means is that this property doesn't actually exist in my Prisma. So if I just open this up here and do like this, do I need to zoom a little bit more, Dom? Can you see it?
It looks good from my side, but I guess one bump doesn't hurt just for someone else out there. Yeah.
Cool. So we have, this is the model from Prisma. And over here, we have the model in STLs. Now, we're not talking about TypeScript types yet. We're just talking about generically what the interface it looks like. There's nearly a one-to-one mapping, but there's this new field I literally just added, which is an STL property. So over here in the service, which if you're not familiar with Redwood, this is a result essentially. So we're saying whenever a query posts or post or any of these mutations come in, it goes into our service file and it executes whichever the relevant function is for the query or mutation. So here you'll notice that there's no error here, even though in theory there should be an error. And let me demonstrate why this matters. So I have my GraphQL playground running. This is pointing at a version 2.1, I believe. So when I query my post with that STL property, it's breaking the API, right? And if we look at our logs a little bit here, see, it's going to say, hey, you're trying to return null for this field. And what that is essentially telling us is that if we look at the TypeScript type for Prisma, you can see that there's no STL on the property because I didn't add it to my database. But it's funny that we're not getting an error here in the TypeScript, which is sometimes it can get you into trouble. So this is how it was in V2. In V3, we've improved this significantly. So now here I have exactly the same setup, but you can see now it's now going to give you errors all over the place to say, hey, you can't just do that. You're missing a property. These type errors are a little bit difficult to read. I totally agree and totally understand, but unfortunately, sometimes this is just how TypeScript is. And for a second, we'll saw clear. There's lots of errors here, but the useful message is just second. You haven't passed all the required properties to here, and it's saying STL only property string that's missing. So let's make this error go away. And the way it would go away is it like let's just free, right? In theory, you would do this mainly when you're fetching, let's say, external data, or you have some sort of calculation that you do that you don't store in your database. So if I return the post here, the full post, which includes the, oh, thank you, Coco. And then we also include the STL only property, you see that there. So really, the main change here is that it's going to help you find these sort of bugs that happen not only at runtime, which you would see before anyway, but this happens at build time as well, or actually at dev time. So you can see what the issue is. I can see there are a few questions on chat. Okay, sorry, my sound is a little bit, yeah, people are a little bit loud here sometimes. Sec. I know how to switch.
John, can you still hear me?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yes, this should be better. Not as full sounding, but you know, hey. Cool. So this is one of the many things that go into these types that are in here. What you also get is, for example, if you remove certain properties, which you could always do before, the TypeScript types will now reflect the type you're returning. This is a harder one to demo because, as you know, if you pass more things than the type implies, it's not an error. That's totally fine. So it's not something I can show that it's erroring out, but it's very useful when, for example, let me go to, so in this example, the same example Dom had, I'm going to remove this here. I'm going to generate types so my errors go away. And notice here that a post has a relation for author, right? Which is a user type. So if I just quickly open up my user SDL, and let's say I want to return just, I don't want to return the roles, I don't want to return the posts, and I only want to return, whenever a user is queried, I only want to return these three things. So this is another new thing that we'll see. So let me first show you what happened in V2. So purple is V2, remember. So in the SDL, we already have authored user. But the types that you get with the SDL, they actually map the Prisma post type into what you should return from the query resolvers. This has been this way, and this is the recommended way that Prisma suggests, and the Guild and all of the blog posts you read online suggest. This is how you do it, which is you just need to map your Prisma type and you're good to go. But there is a situation that can happen. So let's use this as an example. I already am taking a post out here. And what you can do sometimes is maybe you want to return the post author. So what you could do here is directly include author. True. Everything's good, no problems. But what if someone comes along and says, hey, I just want to select from author, I just want the ID. Okay, so this is, again, quite a contrived example, but what I'm saying here is it's going to return a post, and inside that post, it's going to have an author, and inside that author, it's going to have an ID, which number string doesn't, I'm not really sure exactly. So here, if you do that, you'll notice that there are no errors again. Why should this be an error? Because in our SDL type, we said the user type is what we return. So if I open up the user SDL again, you can see that the user has these required parameters. Users always have an email, always have a full name. So this could potentially result in an error, because if the client queries for an email, it's going to try and resolve that, and it's going to say, okay, you didn't give me an email. That's definitely not the correct thing to do. Now, in V3, we also solved this as a problem. Hopefully, I haven't lost everyone here. So V3, let's continue with the example that I had. So if I just added an ID here in V3, it's going to complain. Again, the errors are a little bit hard to read and hard to find the important bits, but here you can see the type, property, author are incompatible. So in the other case, I used Prisma select, but here it was doing effectively the same thing. So if I look at my author here, it needs an email, an ID, and a full name, right? So if I put the ID, I think it was a number, so email, and what was the other one? Full name. There we go. It goes away. So this is the new types that are giving you far more completion. And as you saw while I was typing, it was also giving me auto completion to help with these sort of situations. So in this particular example, you're likely not to see a lot of the benefits because the test project we're showing is very, very simple. But as your resolvers and your models get bigger and more complex with many more relations, this is going to help you find a lot more bugs. Yeah, so that's where these relations and the query resolvers have better types. There's a slight change in the resolver types here. You'll notice they're called post relation resolvers. That's what we're calling this section here. Nothing worth highlighting until you run into a problem. You'll see it'll help you solve that problem as we go along.
Danny, you get all that even without using strict mode, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So you're getting all of this. This project isn't configured with strict mode. So you're getting all of that without strict mode. So in version 3, the other thing that's new also is strict mode. So this is how you enable strict mode in TypeScript. I opened up the TS config on my API side only for now. And as soon as you do that, prepare yourself for a barrage of red squiggles, because strict mode puts TypeScript into pedantic mode. So if that's your thing, it can be very useful to find all sorts of errors that you might have. What I did also was, after I turned on strict mode, I regenerated the types. And now let me restart my TypeScript server, and what I'm expecting to see here is that in update post, it's going to complain, hey, we didn't have an error here before, by the way. So let me quickly remove this so that we're not confusing intentionally creating error versus an actual error. So here it's saying update post. There you definitely didn't used to be an error here. This error here will look quite complicated, so I will explain the gist here. And it's a very important thing, whether you use TypeScript strict mode or JavaScript or whatever. There's a slight mismatch between what GraphQL considers a empty type, so a nullable type. In this case, if I go into my post SDL, string, the title, body, and author ID, these are all optional, which means if you sent title null or you sent title undefined, GraphQL will accept it. But you have to be very careful, because if you send here, if we sent title to null, what that would do is it would remove the title entirely from the post. That's not the behavior we're probably looking for. And this is common when you have form libraries that just take values off. So it can happen. This is where strict mode is helping us. And what you can do to get rid of this error, because it's a very likely error that you might come across, is we have this new utility function, which calls, which you can import from Redwood API. And what this will do is it'll go through the input that we're supplying in update post and just remove all of the nulls from that. And this makes sure that you don't accidentally unset a variable that you didn't mean to unset. Yep, so that's one of the things in strict mode. Sorry, there's so many things I'm trying to remember.
No, yeah.
Yes.
I have a question on that.
Yeah, please.
So did I understand that right, that if you pass in the title with the value null, the field in the database will become empty?
Yes, that's right. So, and the reason for that is there's a really great article. This is all covered in our docs, by the way, in strict mode, talking about remove nulls. Here, this is the gist of it. For GraphQL, from the client, optional fields can be null. That's totally valid, and that's something GraphQL accepts. But Prisma interprets null differently. Null is a value which will unset, whereas undefined is the thing that does nothing. So when you switch on strict mode, it's giving you this extra level of security to say, hey, watch out, this is probably an error. And it just points out for you cases where this might happen. At the same time, it's worth noting that if you don't want this, you may, maybe you want the ability to remove a value. In that case, you don't need to use the remove nulls utility, because if you use it, you won't be able to unset your value. And the reason it's complaining is because if we look at our Prisma schema for post, here, I always get confused between the SDL and schema syntax, but here we're saying title is a non-nullable property. That's why it was complaining. If title was a nullable property, it wouldn't tell you that, hey, you're trying to set a nullable property to null, that's fine. But if you're trying to set a non-nullable property to null, it will complain. And this is the reason it highlights that error. Any more questions? Cool. So now that we've talked about the deep stuff, I will show you one other thing that V3 ships with, which is better types for WebAuthn. So a lot of people have asked for this quite a lot. And for example, let's say you have your forgot password option. So what I've opened up is API source function auth. So this is your WebAuthn auth handler. So here, let's say I want to do something with user, but as soon as I type it, there's no autocompletion because TypeScript just doesn't know what user is. It knows it's a record, but it doesn't know what this type is. Now, what you can do now is you can simply pass the type of the user model through to the GraphQL, so through to this WebAuthn handler options as a generic. Be careful where you import it from because the auto import there that's not the thing we want. We definitely don't want the types GraphQL. What we want is the type from Prisma. So if I import it from Prisma client here, we now get this nice full auto-completion here. And this is the difference between the Prisma type and the GraphQL type. We never reveal hash password, reset token, these sort of things through the SDL. Whereas in Prisma, we do have access to it. So in your forgot password handler, or maybe in your login handler, if you want to use it, you do have access to it. So this is the super simple way of just passing your user type. And it's important because WebAuthn, if we scroll down a little bit, it lets you configure what the auth model that you're using is called. So we can't just assume it's called user. So it's up to you to say, hey, maybe you called your auth model member. In that case, it'll use db.member. And of course, it's getting an error here because member doesn't exist in your model. But if you did that, you would need to import member from here and pass the member through so that it knows how to handle it throughout the code base. Final thing is to call out that we have a huge number of docs now in the TypeScript section. Very importantly, we have this core concept section because we've cleaned up a lot of the types and how to use the utility types, how to use the generated types. And in general, once you go through this, hopefully you're going to start to get a feel of how Redwood organizes its types. So the next time you're hitting an error, let's say, maybe the type is too broad, like a record, it very likely supports the generic that you can just pass through to get a tighter type in your code. So please take a look at the docs here. We're open to feedback. Strict mode is available, so please let us know if you face any issues once you switched your project to strict mode. All the docs are here. There are a few things you do have to do. As soon as you turn on strict mode, there's red everywhere. So this doc will guide you through what are the things do I need to do to convert my project to a strict one. And that's it in TypeScript. I still have to talk about Fastify, right, Tom?
Yeah, that was months of work. Thank you so much, Danny. And I know there were a lot of almost once you start getting into very strict types, you start getting into philosophical questions almost of what is a resolver and what is the true difference here. So, and some really intense discussions. Alex, do you have a question?
Yes, my question is, I found myself, so I use the generator commands for SDL in the types generator. And when I program, I find myself expanding my Prisma schema. And then sometimes in the past, I forgot to expand my SDL. And then when I did the generator command, it didn't fill in the other fields that I now have in my schema file. So am I just using the wrong workflow and I should have it side by side and expand it simultaneously? Or yeah, so the SDL is just meant to be run once, right?
It's a good point. So like this, it isn't exactly related to what we just discussed, but it's a good, very good question. So what happens when you build out your project is you start off with like a simple schema like this, but over time, what you might do, if I understand you correctly, is that you might say the post now has something else in here, new project.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So one thing you could do, your workflow is perfectly fine, by the way. This is totally normal that it happens. So the key thing you have to remember here is that the GraphQL layer is sort of an API gateway, right? So if you don't list it in your SDL, it won't expose this. And that is by design. Because, for example, let me say I add a new private property here. So this is a string, and this is meant to be never reveal exposed to the client, right? So as long as we don't have the private property in the SDL, we're safe. So this is why you do need to be a little bit careful when you use the generators. When you first start out, it's great, but as your project expands, you do need to be a little bit careful. But one way to get around your problem is to regenerate this SDL. So you could generate SDL post. This isn't going to work because I haven't migrated my Prisma client yet. But as long as you use the force flag here, it will overwrite the SDL. It's not ideal because it will overwrite some of the code. So you can use that. You can use Git to see what the diff is between the old one and the new one. But your workflow is perfectly fine. The only thing I can recommend is I would avoid doing this unless your stuff is very, very simple. I would manually add things that are relevant to your client once you've added it to your model.
Yeah, okay, great point, thank you.
Is there a version of that is a little more nuanced? So for instance, in your example, you were doing an addition, right? So you're just adding a property. Is there a version of that command where it say generate SDL post for this property and it knows not to overwrite anything else, but go ahead and add the new property to the SDL? Or is that a pipe dream that just came up with?
No, that's definitely not something we support. I worry that it sounds like a great idea for us to try and implement. But my worry with this thing, without thinking too deeply about it, is that there's so many edge cases. In particular, I'm worried about revealing things that you don't want to reveal to your client. So a user is the best example. If you accidentally just, once you've added your user SDL and your user hash password, all of those things, if you generate your SDL at that point, you might accidentally reveal it, right? So you do need to be aware of what the generators are giving you. You can't just take it at, when you first start out, yes, because it's simple. But as your project grows, it's better that you take your time to look at what you're adding to your API. And really, there's no way we can guarantee that we won't accidentally reveal things that you didn't want to on your API. So that's what I worry about. Even if we implement that feature, for me, that would be the blocker from getting it out to everyone.
Yep, makes sense.
So final thing that I wanted to discuss before I pass it back to Dom is the new server config that you get in V3. So we now have this new function in API server config.js here, which is essentially a hook. It's a hook that will be triggered when you first start up your server. And what this lets you do is really tap into, like, configure your Fastify instance however you want. This is something that was missing in the previous versions. We're now giving you a lot more control. So the reason this is very powerful is because, as people familiar with Fastify will know, it has an amazing ecosystem of plugins. Most of this I've never tried myself, but I'm sure as soon as you come across a problem, there is a plugin that will probably solve what you're facing. So do take a look at the Fastify ecosystem if you're curious what is out there. But in this demo, what I'm just going to show is there's a really simple health check plugin here. I think one of these, yeah, here we go, Fastify health check. And I'm just going to set that up in my project and just show how it works. So if we go over to their docs first, one of the things you need to do with Fastify plugins is you need to register it on the Fastify instance itself. So typically it's when you're creating your API, creating your Fastify instance. Redwood does this for you under the hood. So until now, we didn't really expose the hook for you. Whereas now what you can do is in that function, literally copy this here. And you can see that in this hook, we have the Fastify instance passed in, and we can add that Fastify health check plugin here. Of course, you need to do a yarn workspace API add Fastify health check. I've already done that, so there's no need here. Let me turn off this server. And once I run dev here, what this health check plugin does, by the way, is it just adds a new 8921. It adds a new health checkpoint. 920, no, 921. Sorry, my bad. Oh, I have errors in my project. Of course, it's not gonna do stuff. Let me just undo these things here. Okay. And let's see, there we go. It's revealed this new health endpoint here. And this is a really simple case of using Fastify plugins, but depending on your use case, depending on how you use Fastify, you can now access their ecosystem. This is a very new feature, so please do let us know if something isn't working or you find edge cases. We're happy to help you with that if you raise a GitHub issue, preferably with reproduction. One of the things I'm going to highlight, and it is highlighted in the template, which is if you deploy to Netlify or Vercel, these settings will not apply to your project. So this is really important to note. Fastify is only used when you're deploying with a server full configuration. So if you're deploying to, let's say, Fly or to Render, or even you have your bare metal setup, that's when it's going to use Fastify. Whereas if you deploy to Lambdas, if you deploy to Vercel or to Netlify, it's not going to use Fastify. These plugins will not be registered. The workflow for using a server flow one is usually a little bit different. And often it's already supported by Netlify or Vercel. If you look into their docs, you'll probably find it. But this is worth highlighting. Don't just configure Fastify and assume that once you deploy, it'll all work. It depends on how you're deploying your Redwood app, whether it takes effect or not. Cool. So that's it from me. Any questions about Fastify?
Yeah, so I think I read that version 3 focuses more on the server full deployment Is that correct?
I don't think we've really shifted focus really. It remains the same whether you deploy serverless or serverful. It's just that we're noticing more and more people take up the serverful option. So perhaps that's why you may see a shift, because our roadmap is dictated by the community and particularly by startups and projects that are building it. So when they start using the serverful stuff and they're like, hey, I can't do this, automatically it drives our roadmap a little bit. But that doesn't mean we've shifted focus necessarily.
Yeah, no, I mean, I highly appreciate it because I'm also more on the serverful side. So with this Fastify, because I was struggling before with getting, like, for example, a scheduler service to run in my bare metal deployment. And now I found a workaround. I also posted my findings on the forum. But with this Fastify, it seems like there is now this entry point where I can say, okay, start this, start that, right?
Yes, you could do that. I would be careful in this particular case because one of the things you want to do is keep your scheduled or crons separate from your main API, right? It's just a matter of like, you don't want, if your cron server falls down or hangs up, you don't want your main API server to fall over, right?
Okay.
So you can certainly do that, but I would think about it carefully before.
So all the Fastify ecosystem is basically like add-ons for my API, and I should just consider it as like making my API more sophisticated in a way.
Yes, that's how I would think about it.
I'll say to tease a little bit, I guess, like when we implemented that hook, you're right, Alex, that like it was a hook into Fastify, and it technically does let you do anything you can do with Fastify, but we're pushing back a bit on, like, I don't know, defining a random route, things like that, because we want, anytime you implement anything on the API side, you want testing, you want like mocks, like you just want as much coverage as you can. And we didn't have architecture for just like adding a route, for instance. We have no idea how you can test that, or like how to, this server config file is at the root, or it's not in source. And that we don't want like users to have to worry about it too much, but that means it's not quite getting the Babel treatment that other files in source would. So we're exposing that hook mainly just to add plugins. But yeah, feel free to stretch the limits a little bit and let us know where you run into stuff. But it should work for plugins, but it may not work for like the entirety of what Fastify can do. But definitely
Yeah,
something we're thinking about.
Yeah, and a really, really great one, great plugin, maybe it's worth trying, is the Prometheus plugin. So I know especially if your project is bigger or you work in a big company, that's one of the things that'll come up. How do you monitor your Redwood app, right? And there's loads of ways of doing it, but maybe a super easy way of monitoring your API side is just by adding the monitoring plugin. I think it's called Prometheus plugin or something. You add it in and it should work with Fastify the same way. I've personally not tried it, but it's an example of you taking advantage of the ecosystem in Fastify as well.
It's called a Fastify metrics.
Well, I'm gonna switch to we got two more things, I think, at least. The one is WebAuthn that Danny had mentioned. So here I have the same app, just the test project that's just like a blog. And sorry, let me show the release notes first here. WebAuthn support. So this is like just a brand new feature, nothing like breaking about it. But for anyone who's using dbauth, if you click there's instructions for adding support here. But it's basically a way of using things like Touch ID to log in as if you were typing in your password. And I don't know specific like public key cryptography stuff, that's above what I'm gonna talk about, but just the user experience setting up. If you already have DVAuth set up to do this, you could just follow. Rob has written like very detailed notes for how to do this. Like I think somewhere, yeah, adding like certain config to the dbauth function on the API side. If you haven't modified your dbauth function like too much, you could just run setup auth force and then yarn redwood generate dbauth force. And if you make sure everything's checked in to get, you can use the source control to see what's new and what's different, and just add the pieces that you need, like the credential model and things like that. So, but setting up is just make sure you you're going to need to touch the Prism schema a bit and add a new model. But everything should, this guide here is complete. Like it'll walk you through everything. But when you look, what it looks like when you set it up is when you go to log in, I think you're first going to have to like make an account as a user. So I'm just going to do a simple one here. And then if I log out and I go to log in again, once I enter my password once, it'll ask me if I never want to do that again. And I'm going to turn this on. So this is like device specific. It obviously only affects my device. And I don't know if you can all see the Google Chrome thing that just popped up. Okay, well, I'm going to touch my finger on the Touch ID pad and then I'm just in. That's how I log in the future now for this site, since it uses Touch ID. And I enabled it and it has the feature, but that might seem simple. Hopefully it's like it definitely feels like a better DX experience, but you can find all the docs here, and I'll just go over the files one more time. So, whoops. So in Prisma schema, you need to add these two fields to the user model, WebAuthn challenge credentials, and the user credential model. And again, like just in the docs, and then you're gonna add a few things to the API auth function. Sorry, this is really tiny. So I don't know all of them here, but there's a new, I think, WebAuthn field that has a bunch of specific configurations. And all of these are like meticulously documented, and there's a bunch of things you can change, but everything should just like work out of the box. So don't feel like you have to like understand everything or tweak every setting. It's just there for you in case you want to do it, but by no means are you like, required to I don't know, change platform or anything like that. And then the main thing that's different is the sign up page. If you've used the DAuth template, is the same, but the login page now is a little different because it's going to check like if it should do the prompt for WebAuthn and where it should redirect the user. So you're definitely going to want to add this page back if you've made it already. Like check out this diff, and like there's like a bit of a React component to this of just getting the user like onboarded and signed up. But other than that, just a new feature that if you like it, you're free to add it. And before I go on, any questions about that one? Okay, awesome. Rob's always working on DBAuth, so I'm sure there'll be something else new in the next minor or major. One thing I want to highlight now is in tandem with like the new Jest. So we've upgraded Jest twice in the past major. They happen to release two majors like fairly quickly in tandem. 29 just kind of had a few minor changes that were the snapshot format changes. I don't know if they actually showcase the difference here, but oftentimes when you do a Jest snapshot, it'll say like array or object, basically like what is the thing that it snapshotted instead of just like the syntax for it. So they turn that off. You're free to turn it back on. That's more of like I don't know, it's really tiny detail, but 28 had like the snapshot format will matter if you use that a lot and you're going to have to upgrade your app. So that's why you should be aware of it. But 28 had more of like the new features. And the one we want to point you to specifically is sharding. So it's like built into Jest now and fairly easy to do. Redwood doesn't like do it for you. It doesn't automatically pass this flag or anything, but you can pass this flag to the Redwood test command, just like you can pass any of these Jest flags. So if you've had, like, especially in CI, if you have like a lot of tests and you're looking for ways to speed execution up, like definitely look into this feature here. Let me post that in chat real quick. So there's quite a few other things in 28 here. A new, yeah, but that's one we want to point you to specifically. And Danny's done like a lot of work to make sure things run a little faster this time. And now that we've like kind of settled on some of the how Redwood works, like its API, we're turning our attention like when we can to performance. So I'm not sure if this is going to be the most detailed of, we haven't done like, we need metrics in CI running for, sorry, here's the V2 one. I'm going to put V2 on the left and V3 on the right, basically. And I'm going to run yarn Redwood test for web, and just hopefully, this is by no means like a scientific experiment, but just to give like a qualitative idea of like things are a little faster. If I run these both at the same time, hopefully you'll see, well, I'm not sure why the one on the left isn't even starting. So whatever it is, V3 is basically faster is all I'm trying to say. The CLI should boot up a little faster. Test should run a little faster. We had some people saying like, it's just not worth writing tests. Like and we totally get that. Like you need a tight feedback loop. So we're trying to make things like this, like bring it into our attention, especially as projects scale and you add like hundreds of tests. If you're going to realistically like keep that velocity, you need to have speed. Like it's not just like a nice to have at that point. It is like essential. So you can expect like you can expect the performance to be like a bit better basically in V3. And when we actually have, I don't know, statistically determined metrics, we'll be sure to share those with you. But I just feel like you could probably expect a qualitative boost in like DX. I think that may have been everything we wanted to cover in V3. Yeah, we're always looking to like, if the release notes are super thorough, we want to make sure like upgrading is easy. I know maybe I will call attention to like one Jest bug if you happen to encounter it, is sometimes Jest, what they did was they started following the rules like a little better in terms of the package.json exports field. So sometimes if you're running a test on the website, it will import a version of a module using ESM, which uses import export, and Node, if you're running CommonJS, doesn't understand any of that stuff and it'll complain. So if you happen to run into that one, we do have docs for it in the release notes in the breaking changes section. And one more link here. It might seem like it's a little complicated, but towards the end, we have like a drop down there that'll walk through exactly what you can do to like have it resolve the right module. But if you do run into that one, please just like ask us. And every module is a little different, but it usually ends up being solved with the same strategy. But yeah, Danny and I are happy to hang around for a few minutes if someone has questions or is curious about like what's coming next, or other little things in V3 or anything.
So I'm curious about WebSockets and like communication. So what I'm envisioning is like you have a server that's like Redwood is already, where you have a database, you have users, the users can have settings and so on and so forth. But then you also have a WebAssembly crypto wallet on the client browser, and you want to establish a WebSocket connection to the server and kind of like also have that communication channel. And I mean, I'm not super experienced, so maybe GraphQL subscriptions is something that's going in this direction. But yeah, any thoughts would be welcome.
Yeah, so this is something we get asked all the time with subscriptions, or there's this other thing called live queries in GraphQL, which you can use. It's not something we've made any progress on since we last looked at it. The main issue with these sockets or subscriptions is that they run only on server full environments, and there are caveats to how you use it. One of the philosophies that we've always had is it doesn't matter where you deploy, your code basically stays the same. Your config just changes, and you can switch from Brazil to render to fly the next day without you thinking about it. So that, for me personally, that's one of the reasons it doesn't go up our priority list at the moment, especially because there's so many other things to solve before we even get to before we decide that we want to now split the server full and the serverless deployment paths. And I'm also not sure whether that's the best thing to do, because then Redwood loses its simplicity a little bit. You then need to start thinking about where does it run, how does it run before you even finish your product, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the only thing I would say is very often people will ask for subscriptions and ask for live queries, that sort of thing, when really maybe there's a different way to solve that problem that would be much simpler. But in this particular case, I don't really know. Well, like connection from your WASM thing to an API, I'm not sure why you would even want a socket there for real-time stuff. Yeah, but maybe I don't understand the problem better.
One question from Jay O'Connor in the chat, I wanted to make sure I got right, Danny, was for pre-rendering. If the parameter value hasn't been pre-rendered, will it fall back to just like the client side, completely client side rendering?
Yes and no. So you do need to be careful with this one, a little bit, not careful. Because it'll error out and you'll know there's nothing hidden there. So for example, if in the past you had a pre-render prop on something that has a root parameter, it would just ignore it, right? So it would just render the loading state, or and then once the JavaScript loaded, it would actually load the code and render the cell. Now, if you have a pre-render prop set on something with a root parameter now, when you build your app, it's just going to error out to say, hey, you didn't supply the parameter. And that's by design, because we want to encourage you to use root parameter pre-rendering where required. But if you don't want it, and there are certainly cases where you don't want it, I personally have used it in my app where I don't want it to render pre-render it. You can just set the pre-rendered prop to false, and it should take care of it, as in it'll skip pre-rendering something and fall back to client-side rendering. Hopefully that answers your question, Jay.
Yeah, not exactly. So like the example that you gave for pre-rendering was blog posts. So you pre-render, blog post number 033 through 3. And what happens when blog post number 4 is created?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. In that case, it'll fall back to client-side rendering. So
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, it's not going to error out. Okay, any more questions? There's one about React Native. Dom's already answered.
Yeah, I don't know if there's something public I could share that one of the startups has, but I know like quite a few have had some custom, and I know you definitely have thoughts on it, Danny, about like what it would look like in like Expo or something else, but nothing like we could give you a setup command for at the moment. But it's more than doable for sure. But it's all doable by you right now, unfortunately. No Redwood help.
Yeah, and like there's a lot to debate on how much we want to dictate on the mobile side anyway. We haven't really made we haven't had any team discussions on it yet. But if you want to build a mobile app side, there's nothing stopping you from using, like fully leveraging the API side, the GraphQL endpoint, and then you build your mobile app the same way you normally do. But like Dom said, you won't get some of the niceties that Redwood Web has, like with cells or scaffolds and that sort of thing.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Is everyone happy with V3? You've tried it, right? Yeah, everyone's here, so everyone's just tried it already and found no bugs. That's why there are no issues. No, I'm joking. Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, please do let us know how you find V3. That's really important because especially as the code base is getting more complicated and bigger, all of this feedback really helps us, target our focus a little bit better.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I guess we'll call it there, and look at redwoodjs.com/events for more things coming up. We're gonna try to get contributors workshop back next week, and then we have office hours as always, I think every week, but we're gonna get more minors out. You can look forward to like weekly releases on those to make sure you get like the latest of a dependency library like React Hook Form or something. So but yeah, thanks, and we'll see you on the forums or Discord or GitHub.